Ah, Mrs Beeton, truly the doyenne of British domesticity. She sadly only wrote one book before dying at 28. But it was a seminal work. Mrs Beeton's book of household management is to this day still used by many of Britain's famous period dramas, and it is often said that without her, the British food culture, and by extension the global one, simply wouldn't be what it is today. Don't take our word for it. The Oxford English Dictionary Thesaurus section lists Mrs Beeton as a valid replacement for the expression authority on cooking. There is only one little problem. Before we get to the problematic bits, let's go over the life of Isabella Beeton. Isabella Beeton was born right here in London as Isabella Mason, the eldest of 3 daughters of a linen merchant. She spent her early childhood here in the city of London, as the family lived in Milk Street, in the literal shadow of St Mary le Bow, making her a real authentic Cockney. When Isabella was 4, her father passed away. 3 years later, her mother married Henry Dorling, the clerk of the Epsom Derby racecourse. So the family, now known as the Dorlings, moved to Epsom in Surrey, just south of London. However, Isabella was first sent to boarding school, here in Islington, and then to here in Heidelberg. Yeah, we didn't have the budget to just pop to Germany and back. When we say she went to school in Heidelberg, it is just that. School, not the university. In Heidelberg, she was taught how to be a well-rounded Victorian lady. She learned French, German, and even mathematics. Upon moving back to England, she apparently took a few lessons on pastry making from a local baker in Epsom. However, shortly after returning, she got married to Samuel Orchard Beeton. Isabella had known Samuel since they were youngsters. After all, she went to school with his sisters. That's some wingman work for you there. So far, this is all sounding like the plot of a very dull period drama. Isabella's sisters married a lawyer and a doctor, and if Isabella had followed their example, British culinary history would have looked quite different. That's because Samuel Beeton's chosen profession was that of publisher. According to Catherine Hughes, who wrote The Short Life and Long Times of Mrs Beeton, the book which sort of serves as a backbone to this video, the Dorlings, Isabella's family, weren't too keen on the union with the Beeton boy, given the patchy reputation of his family, who tended to appear in the law reports for all the wrong reasons. Samuel's younger brother, for instance, would accrue an impressive record just in his teens, causing him to even flee the country. Samuel, however, didn't have any convictions that we know of. So the wedding went ahead, but Isabella's family had, let's say, reservations. Now, her family might have had reservations. Isabella did not. Correspondence between the lovebirds before the marriage indicated that they were up for it. The cliché of the Victorian lady having to lie back and think of England, not a problem here. They got married in July of 1856, and in August of that same year, she found out she was pregnant. The Beetons were a pretty typical middle-class household. Isabella had some help around the house, depending on their budget. And their budget fluctuated quite a bit. We'll get to that. When they were flush, she had help of 2 other ladies in the house. Not shabby, but hardly the full staff of a Victorian manor. They were a modern family though, because despite being pregnant, Isabella went to work. I don't think you need a pillow there, mate. Anywho, Mrs Beeton joined Mr Beeton in the publishing business. In March of 1857, heavily pregnant, she was already writing for one of Samuel's magazines, the English Woman's Domestic Magazine. Bit of a literal name there, isn't it? She started by translating some pieces from French and German into English, and then went on to write her own pieces like The Nursery and Cooking, Pickling and Preserving. Then, in May of 1857, Sam and Isabella welcomed their first son, Samuel Orchard Beeton. Not big on originality, were they? May, April, September... Bang on the wedding night! Bang. A few months after the birth of little Samuel, Isabella Beeton wrote a very important letter to an acquaintance named Henrietta English. Mrs. English was a middle-aged lady who had worked for some of the most prestigious families in the land. She was extremely well connected in the culinary establishment of Britain at the time. Mrs. English was the French wife of an English footman. This made her very well placed in the culinary scene of 19th century London. This isn't just us playing up a national stereotype, by the way. In the 19th century, Britain might have been ruling a quarter of the real world. The culinary world was firmly French. As we saw in our video on tourism, even in the 18th century, it was already fancy to employ a French cook in the household. In the 19th century, it had only become more widespread. One of the best things you could do to get higher pay working in the kitchen of a great family was, well, be French. Anyway, back to Mrs. Beeton. Mrs. Beeton told Mrs. English she was thinking of writing a cookbook and asked if Mrs. English had any ideas. Mrs. English, judging by her reply, wasn't too impressed with the whole idea and wrote Isabella the following letter. I see difficulties in your way as regards publishing a book on cookery. Cookery is a science that is only learned by long experience and years of study, which of course you have not had. Ooh, ouch! She did have a point. For example, one time Isabella wrote a recipe for a good sponge cake, which makes sense. She had taken some baking lessons after all. However, in the recipe, she forgot to mention how much flour to use. Mrs. English, however, does offer some advice in the form of an alternative. Therefore, my advice would be compile a book from receipts from a variety of the best books published on cookery, and heaven knows there is a great variety for you to choose from. This is important, remember this. So in July of 1857, it did look like everything was coming up Mrs. Beeton. Married to a man she was madly in love with, working with said husband as a translator and writer, and a newborn baby in the crib. This is where we get to the tragic part of Isabella Beeton's life, where she was very much not blessed with good fortune. And that's the health of her and her children. In August of 1857, young Samuel sadly passed away, after having struggled with ill health his entire short life. Don't worry, we won't be making any silly jokes about this. It looks like Mrs. Beeton responded to this by throwing herself at her work. Catherine Hughes theorizes that this is when she properly started work on her book of household management. Yes, like proper Victorians, the Beetons bit through the grief by throwing themselves at their work. This all culminated in 1859, when Isabella gave birth to another son, again named Samuel Orchard Beeton. This was also the start of a 2-year run in which the English Woman's Domestic Magazine was published with 48-page supplements. And all these supplements combined would go on to form Beeton's Book of Household Management. Launching books in parts via magazines was quite common, and it still happens today. Think comic strips being released via newspaper or magazine installments. It's not as big as it used to be, but it still happens. In 1860, the Beetons stepped it up even more. The English Woman's Domestic Magazine went through a bit of a relaunch, now promoting Mrs. Beeton to editress, alongside Samuel as editor. In addition, the Beetons worked on a brand new magazine aimed at women, called The Queen. Oh, that's a bit more original. Kinda nice. Then, in 1861, they launched Beeton's Book of Household Management in full. A tome of 1,112 pages, containing not just cookery, but tips on how to run a proper Victorian household. As per the first page, it contained information for the mistress, housekeeper, cook, kitchen maid, butler, footman, coachman, valet, upper and under housemaids, ladies' maids, maid of all work, laundry maid, nurse and nursemaid, monthly wet and sick nurses, and then it generally goes etc, etc, before moving on to sanitary, medical and legal issues as well. Okay, let us point out here that Isabella Beeton is 25 at this point. What were you doing at 25? When the Book of Household Management came out, it sold very well. And while we haven't been able to pin down exact figures, it is often claimed that nearly 2 million copies were sold in the following decade. Now, you might think that with the new child, some popular magazines and a successful book, things were looking up for the Beetons. Well, no. They actually lost money, forcing them to abandon their house at the edge of London and instead go and live above their publishing shop on the Strand. This probably also meant that Isabella now had to make do without house help. So, if their stuff was selling, how was this happening? Well, we have Samuel to thank for that. You see, the man was horrible at business. Let us give some examples on just how useless this guy was. In 1860, there was talk about a tax on paper being scrapped. Now, the publishing industry anticipated, correctly, that this would actually cause a short spike in paper prices as demand went up. Samuel Beeton thought he'd play a blinder and buy before the peak. So he bought a massive amount of paper, while the legislation was still in the Commons. However, the legislation got held up in the Lords, not that uncommon in those days. So the tax only got scrapped in 1861, when the spike in price did indeed happen. However, Samuel had already gone through all his paper, so he now had to restock during the peak. Whereas more shrewd dealers had waited for the scrapping of the tax to get through the Lords, and stocked up on paper before the law received loyal assent. So not only did Samuel have to buy paper to print the Book of Household Management during a price spike, his competitors got their paper on the cheap. So a large part of the Book of Household Management's windfall was already being gobbled up, well, just by that. If this guy had been alive today, he'd be knee-deep in NFTs. Well, think that's bad. It gets worse. In 1862, the Beetons sold their newest magazine, The Queen, using the money from that sale to then move back to Kent and get some cleaner air. However, Samuel omitted to cancel the engraver. His debt racked up for a product he didn't even need anymore. It all ended up in court, where he was ordered to pay the debt. Small little aside, after the sale, The Queen kept going. It was in more business-savvy hands after all, and went on to become an icon of the 60s. Not the 1860s, but the 1960s. Yes, Queen, after dropping the in the 1950s, peaked 100 years after it was founded by Samuel and Isabella Beeton. Then in the 70s it merged with Harper's Bazaar, becoming Harper's and Queen. Then in 2006, the Queen was dropped and it became Harper's Bazaar UK, which is still going. Sadly, things were not going that well for the Beetons. On New Year's Eve of 1862, young Samuel Beeton died, aged 3½. For what it's worth, the Beetons did have 2 more sons, Orchard and Mason Beeton. Thankfully, both of them reached their 80s. Isabella, however, died a week after Mason's birth, in 1865. Samuel did continue to publish the book, as it soon became his main source of income. There are stories out there that he kept publishing it as if she was still alive, but we don't really believe these. You see, he added an obituary note to the book for her. However, in 1866, a wholesale bank collapsed, which hit the entire publishing sector hard. Samuel was forced to sell the rights to his late wife's book to Wortlock and Tyler. Samuel Beeton struggled with debt for the rest of his life until he died in 1877 of tuberculosis. So, a horribly sad and tragic Victorian story. But where's the dark secret? the scandal that we've been foreshadowing. Actually, before we get to that, I'm getting a little bit peckish. Let's cook up something from Beeton's Book of Household Management. It's a bit early in the year for partridge, but let's do this one. Pluck, draw and cut the partridges. We're just doing one. In half and wipe the inside thoroughly with a damp cloth. Season them with salt and cayenne. Broil them over a very clear fire. We are just using our oven. You can't get more clearer than electric heat. While that's in the oven for about half an hour, can we just ask you to, if you've liked the video so far, leave a like. This tells the almighty algorithm that this video is worth watching, and it should then suggest it to more people. If you're new here, it would also be great if you could subscribe. Even if you don't use your subscription feed, it still helps us out a lot. Thank you very much in advance. When the partridge is broiled, Mrs Beeton instructs us to dish them on a hot dish, rub a small piece of butter over each half and send them to the table with brown gravy or mushroom sauce. Would have been nice of her to tell us which type of gravy. As we know from our Lobscouse video, the word gravy had quite a few meanings back then. Anyway, we went with a standard brown beef gravy. Here's our result, one with the gravy and the other with the mushroom ketchup. And it's a fine roast partridge. Actually, that's a very small bird and there's two of us. You might make another one. You know what? We've already done a Beeton recipe, so let's make one from the other famous Victorian cook, Miss Acton. She also has a broiled partridge recipe. Split a young and well-kept partridge and wipe it with a soft, clean cloth, inside and out. But do not wash it. Broil it delicately over a very clear fire. Funny how she also emphasizes clear fire. Sprinkling it with a little salt and cayenne. Rub a bit of fresh butter over it the moment it is taken from the fire. And send it quickly to the table. Don't worry, I'm sure the sauce is different. With a sauce made of a good slice of butter browned with flour, a little water, cayenne, salt and mushroom catsup poured over it. Well, it's different. Here the gravy is seasoned with the mushroom sauce. Oh, well, it looks like it's better. Yes, if you were, like us, wondering how someone in her early 20s, whose only experience in cooking was a few baking classes, managed to write a tome of over 1,000 pages on the intricacies of Victorian household management, while having close to no first-hand experience, while also mourning a lost child, being pregnant and writing for a magazine, all with minimal house help, she wasn't supernatural, she nicked it. Okay, we feel bad going this hard on her after just taking you through her entire sad story. But that doesn't change the fact that this book, which is often touted as the seminal work on Victorian cooking, is full of plagiarism. Maybe it wasn't so bad. One recipe being a bit similar doesn't mean the whole book is full of stolen content. Right? After all, the Book of Household Management isn't just recipes, it's brimming with background knowledge as well. Here's one on the history of pickling. Pickles. The ancient Greeks and Romans held their pickles in high estimation. They consisted of flowers, herbs, roots and vegetables preserved in vinegar, and which were kept for a long time in cylindrical vases with wide mouths. Their cooks prepared pickles with the greatest care, and the various ingredients were macerated in oil, brine and vinegar, with which they were often impregnated drop by drop. Meat, also, after having been cut in very small pieces, was treated in the same manner. Very nice. Now, let us read you a small bit from the Panthropion, a book by the famed cook Alexis Soyer, published in 1853. Also, we're just going to leave Beeton's text up on the side of the screen here. Just cause. The Greeks and Romans esteemed highly their pickles. These consisted of flowers, herbs, roots and vegetables, preserved in vinegar, and which kept a long time in cylindrical vases with wide mouths. They were prepared with the greatest care, and these plants were often macerated in oil, brine and vinegar, with which they were impregnated drop by drop. Meat, also cut in very small pieces, was treated in the same manner. Looks like the advice she got from Mrs. English to just compile a book of existing recipes was taken to heart. To add insult to injury, the first sentence of the preface is her saying that if she had known how much work this book would have turned out being, she wouldn't have started it. Very cheeky. Now, there are some defenses out there. One being, she was young, untrained, and probably had no idea that she wasn't allowed to do this. That doesn't work though, because she and her husband worked in publishing, and copyright law was already very much a thing back then. And of all people, Samuel Beeton would have known this. His first big break in the publishing world was the result of him effectively enforcing copyright on the English print of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it's safe to assume that the man knew how Victorian intellectual property law worked, and he clearly knew a good lawyer. This is where we should point out that this video is not legal advice and is for entertainment purposes only. The Book of Household Management also shows that whoever wrote it knew that they were skirting the lines of what was legally allowable at the time. Firstly, the book doesn't say it is written by Isabella Beeton, but edited by, despite the fact that her name is the first words of the title. Secondly, she does properly attribute original authors when copying text verbatim, which again looks like she knew what she was doing, as a recipe in itself is not copyright protected, but the exact words which form the recipe are. Which is probably why the Beetons properly attributed the original authors when text was borrowed wholesale. The final element in the Book of Household Management that shows that she knew what she was doing were her targets. When her book came out, Francatelli was still very much alive, pretty famous and quite combative. He got into a whole feud with Alexis Soyer. When copying him, the recipes are very heavily adjusted. You can still see the similar techniques, but the whole thing was essentially rewritten from scratch. However, when the original writer was dead and didn't have an estate to enforce any claims, Isabella got bolder. This brings us to Isabella Beeton's biggest victim, Miss Acton. We already saw how similar the partridge recipe was, but there's a lot more. According to Catherine Hughes, see Isabella, this is called referencing, at least a third of Beeton's soup recipes was stolen from Acton, along with a bunch of other methods and preparations. In addition, Beeton is often credited with writing the first modern cookbook, splitting up the ingredients and method. Problem is that Acton did this first. Beeton just put the ingredients ahead of the method, which does make more sense, we'll give her that. So Isabella Beeton knew exactly what she was doing. The intellectual property minimalist will say, isn't every recipe taken from somewhere else anyway? Yes, but even though all knowledge is gathered from somewhere, society wants writers to at least remix or add to the information. For instance, we put a recipe on our website when we uploaded our last video. That recipe did not come to us in a dream or through a divine vision, but it was a combination of elements from different recipes with a little bit of our own spin. On top of that, we tried this recipe ourselves many times. This is not the case in Beeton's book. Let's take the example of macaroni. In Victorian times, macaroni was a sort of catch-all term for various types of pasta. You had the tubes and the ribbons. Today we would call these tagliatelle or pappardelle. Thing is, back then they boiled the tubes for a long time. Admittedly, the tube macaroni here in Britain was quite chunky. Here you can see Mrs. Crocombe breaks him up. The closest present-day equivalent would be bucatini or even behemoths like candele. On the continent, writers of the time like Carême tell us to boil these until ready. But in Britain, for some reason, cookbook writers insisted on including a cooking time. Miss Acton boils hers for 3/4 of an hour, and Francatelli, who probably had his Italian grandfather yelling in his ear, limits his cook time to just half an hour. As you can see, both of these give many modern Italians an aneurysm. Sorry guys. But we can still call them intact. Sort of. Beeton, on the other hand, in her recipe on macaroni soup, calls for just half an hour. Okay, that's long these days, but on the shorter side back then. However, later in her book, she makes dressed macaroni with cheese. Now, where Francatelli and Acton stick to their respective half-hour and 45-minute cook times for various recipes, Isabella adjusts hers, in this case, to 1 hour and 45 minutes. We tried and yeah, it went as you would expect. We think Beeton did some sketchy copying here. Either that or she really likes mush pasta. This shows that Beeton didn't have much innate knowledge of the things she put in her book. So now to conclude the video and explain why we wanted to make this video. Did we do it to just beat up, pun partly intended, a poor lady who suffered with health issues and died well before her time? No. Well, not entirely anyway. You could be very cynical and say, this is all fine. Where's the harm? The lady who got most of her work stolen died before the book came out, and neither her or a publisher or any of the other people Beeton borrowed from ever felt the need to pursue legal action. So no substantial monetary harm was done, and all that remains is just glory and recognition for dead people. Yes, legally there is nothing really to see here. As mentioned before, you can't copyright quantities or a method. God, let's not give Nestle any ideas. But then we get to the historical and moral harm. We wanted to nicely demarcate these, but they dovetail a bit too much. So just bear with us as we go on a little subdued rant. Mrs Beeton never intended, as far as we know, for her work to become a historical source. With the exception of people like Churchill, most works are written for the here and now. So we're not putting the charge of falsifying history at the feet of Isabella Beeton here. It is, however, probably the main reason we made this video. You, dear viewer, need to know this. If you're watching this, and you are still watching this, I take it you have an interest in cultural history. Given all the hype around Beeton, which is still alive today, you will probably see the Book of Household Management as the source on Victorian cooking. You read in there that Victorian macaroni and cheese used to be boiled for almost 2 hours. Now you go and make this into a blog post or a skit or, I don't know, a YouTube video. And of course, you, being a very intelligent person, cite your sources. The Book of Household Management. Because if it's good enough for Downton Abbey, it's good enough for me. And so a myth is born. And it's not your fault. You used and cited historical sources. Also, don't even think about doing this as a YouTube video, it's ours. Back off. We're going to make this in like a year or so, we'll then link back to this one as like the big reveal. Can you imagine, mate, the title and the thumbnail just write themselves? We can do like this, oh no, my Victorian macaroni is mush, and then use like the panic face or something, maybe something like that. Anyway, so jog on. Feel free to make it on TikTok though, we don't go there. Jokes aside, it's always good to compare sources and be critical, even if it is a seminal work. Maybe Mrs Beeton just had very thick macaroni. Maybe the water she had access to was very soft, or maybe it was a misprint at the publisher's. We know that her publisher wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. However, we have a gut feeling that this is a careless copy. No proof, we admit this is conjecture. But in the macaroni and cheese recipe, she calls for Parmesan or Cheshire. Quite different cheeses, but fine. Parmesan being a cheese from the city of Parma. in Italy. Now, Beeton from time to time puts observations between her recipes, and on Italy, she says this. Yeah. Not even Grundy would say that. What we're saying is, Beeton's book should always come with a big mental asterisk for anyone reading it, especially to anyone reading it with a view of disseminating its content. This brings us to our last point, and the one that probably has been bugging you and me for most of this story. The stolen glory. Everyone involved is dead, and Isabella herself never got to enjoy the money she would have gotten from the book. Ergo, no harm, and a very dark poetic justice was served, right? Well, no, because as a society we still honor the dead, and the overshadowing of people like Miss Acton has gotten so ingrained that when you Google Acton, you get pictures of Beeton. Even people who want to write something nice about Acton end up, and given how skewed the search results are, we can't blame them, putting Beeton's picture under their post about Acton. We can rationalize it all we want and make arguments about historical hygiene and whatnot. But when it comes down to it, it just feels wrong. Especially in our day and age. The Beetons went around and took bits and bobs from various other works, gave it a bit of a jumble, and then published it as if it were new. And because neither Mrs Beeton nor her husband had any real experience in the field, they released a bunch of falsehoods into the world. And the innocent reader was unaware that what they were reading was not properly checked. Acton spent 10 years writing her book. She took pains to check that what she was writing was right. In those 10 years, she produced a much shorter and more focused book than Beeton. No medical or legal advice here. When you read Acton's book, you can see that she knows what she's writing about. There are jokes and witticisms, even a dig at a publisher. Beeton has none of that. Apart from some weird takes on foreign food, we think that's because Beeton wasn't familiar with her subject, and hence lacked confidence. When you read an Acton recipe, you can tell it was tested. And if it wasn't, Eliza herself would tell the reader, "I haven't tested this, but I got it from a household that I trust," making the whole thing just better. And yet, there are no photographs of Miss Acton out there. There are a few pictures labeled Miss Acton, including one that even we accidentally used a while back. But they're most likely not her, which is probably why our algorithms serve up Mrs. Beeton's picture even when you're looking for the real thing. Whatever you do, don't ask some bot to generate an image of her. It would just look like this, albeit a bit more Ghibli-ish. Are we being subtle enough? So yeah, please like and subscribe for more handcrafted, organically written videos. And if you really like it, go on and become a member. If there's a mistake in our videos, which we admit happens, it's because I messed up. Not because some bot stole the wrong thing from somewhere. Anyway, thank you very much for watching.